Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's deep dive webinar. I'm able to start over because this will be available on our YouTube channel. My name is Ama Boateng. I am the grassroots associate for Nothing But Nets. I am joined today by my colleague on our communications team, the wonderful people who brought you all the new and interesting conversations, the dynamic storytelling efforts of our leadership summit and everything else that you see that happens mostly off screen and behind the scenes on our Nothing But Nets team. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Chelsea to introduce herself and then kick off today's webinar, which is a training on our LTEs, letters to the editor, which you all will be doing for World Mosquito Day. Thank you again for joining us, Chelsea. I'm passing it over to you now.
Yeah, thanks, Alma. Hi, guys. I know a lot of you have met me before at previous summits. I started in January of 2020 in my role as the Comms and Digital Media Officer with Nothing But Nets. So many of you have even probably seen this presentation from me. So happy to be here as a resource for you guys as you help us, spread the word about the important work that the Global Fund, PMI, and UN institutions are doing to end malaria and get that into your newspapers for World Mosquito Day. I have some time at the end of my presentation for questions. So if you want to just jot those down or throw them in the chat at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to answer any specific questions about what I'm going through today. So let's go ahead and get started. So in this training, we're going to talk a little bit about what an LTE is and what an op-ed is. I know there's often a lot of confusion between what an LTE is and difference between that and an op-ed. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about tips on how to write one and give you a little case study to view one of previous champions LTE submissions, and then tips on how to actually pitch once you've already written. And then we'll do a quick group share, and I'll just share any next steps that we have for getting your LTEs out there for World Mosquito Day. So, let's see, oops, back. No, you'd think I know by now, guys. So what is a letter to the editor? So the purpose of letters to the editors are really to enhance your voice, to enhance community voice. So they've been around as long as newspapers have been around. They are an opportunity for you to publish your views and comment on a recent article or respond to an issue that is concerning you. An op-ed is a little different. It has a very similar goal in that it's trying to win hearts and minds and really get something out there that is relevant in the media cycle. It's short for opposite the editorial page, which is where it was located in the newspaper. So that's kind of the shorthand is op-ed. It's usually a little bit longer. So that kind of leads me into what's the difference between an LTE and an op-ed if they both kind of have the same goal. Letters to the editors are generally shorter, and they're pretty short. They're 150 to 250 words, usually max. And op-eds can reach, anywhere from 500 to, 800 plus words. Letters to the editors traditionally are written in direct response to like an article that's been published. So if Washington Post published an article about Biden's new COVID stimulus package, oftentimes people will send a letter to the editor in response to that article, either stating a view of whether or not they were in support or against or certain things like that. But letters to the editors can also just be a response to a relevant event that's happening across the globe. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in response to an article that the publication has posted recently. And so letters to the editors tend to be more likely to get published than op-eds. This is often because letters to the editors really serve as a community voice, almost like a forum for people to get their thoughts and views out there. And op-eds do the same thing, but they tend to have a longer turnaround because editors need to review. And so it's something that op-eds are something that they're just a little bit more work, and there's something you need to put out there quicker. Whereas letters to the editors, you can just kind of get it out there, and they are more often to be published since they are shorter and a little bit more community oriented. And so why are LTEs important? Hopefully you guys know by now that, the whole point of, being a champion, and that it really is to connect you to your legislators and get your voice out there and make it heard. And this is just a tool in order for you guys to be able to do that. And so there's a forum, there's a chain here of a congressional comms director sort of explaining why LTEs are so important in the fight to win a policy or a bill. It's really about, making your voice heard, because that's where your congressional offices go to get their information. So every morning as a congressional comms director, she would put together all these news stories and send them over to her congressional office. And that is powerful to know, to have something that you've said and you've thrown into into the news cycle, to have that read by your congressional office is extremely powerful. So 9 tips on writing a letter to the editor. I will preface that we are, as a team, going to provide you guys with a toolkit that will help make this easier as far as the writing the letter to the editor. It will include some high-level talking points, keeping it relevant to what's been happening, now, and actually even like a template for you guys to use, but just always good for you guys to know, tips on how to write a letter to the editor effectively. Since I did mention, letters to the editors are extremely short, and so it's really important that you keep it direct and to the point. And oftentimes there's no hard and fast rule for every newspaper. They will say in their submission forms how many words they typically will publish up to, and generally that's around 250 words, but I've seen it as low as 100 words. And so you really have to pay attention when you are submitting to what your newspaper's restrictions are. And then starting with a really strong and powerful first sentence is really important in catching people's attention. That can be, a first sentence in why you are particularly drawn to the fight to end malaria, or your experience with the disease, or just advocating on behalf of the disease, or even someone else that know's experience with the disease. Related to your local communities, you're going to be pitching these into your local newspapers. And so there might be some people wondering why in a local newspaper, say in, like Ohio, why something like malaria is relevant. So we had a champion, Renee Perez, who often would submit op-eds and letters to the editors in Miami, and often what she did to make it relevant to her local community was to talk about how the malaria was impacting her, her community in Venezuela, and there are a lot of Venezuelans who lived in her community as well. So oftentimes she would kind of tie those two points together to really make it relevant to those who would be reading the newspaper in your local community. Don't be afraid to share your own background. Again, you have to keep it pretty brief with a letter to the editor, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a sentence or two in there that talks about your expertise, your experience. I would pick sort of a lane. So if you want to talk about being a Nothing But Nets champion, your major, your job, something that really connects and ties you to why you advocate and do this work is really important in sort of hooking people into like why this issue is important. Personalize the issue. This is sort of the similar tip as to the last one. And so, yeah. And then we will provide this in the toolkit, the call to action. So generally letters to the editors are advocating for a specific bill, a specific action that you want people to take in order to join the fight to end malaria, or you want your congressional office to support a certain bill. And so we'll provide, kind of language around what our particular ask is. But as always, I think I've worked with several champions, you know, on making sure to include at the end some sort of, if you'd like to join me in the fight to end malaria, you can become a champion here. And so we can help tailor that call to action, but it's really, really important to give people the information and then also make sure that they feel like after they've gotten the information, they know where to go in order to be able to take action. And then, of course, be strategic with timeline and milestone. This is why we're having this training around this time, is because World Mosquito Day is coming up on August 20th. And so that is a strategic time for us to be able to be relevant in the news cycle and get something out there that is more likely to be published. And finally, this is something that's way more likely to get your LTE or op-ed published, is making a reference to something in the newspaper. So if there was something on global health, something on COVID, things like that, being able to tie it into as a literal response to the editor, as something, you know, as an article that was published previously in the news outlet that you're pitching to, it's going to increase your likelihood of getting your publication shared. And so just, I think that really makes the case for doing your research on where you're submitting your letter to the editor and what they're sort of talking about currently, so that you can make it most relevant to them and tie it into that. And then, of course, get a second or third pair of eyes on your letter. We will have you guys submit your LTE to us before you reach out to publications to submit. And so we'll be able to be your second and third pair of eyes here to make sure that everything looks good, and that if you guys need any help or have any questions, that we're there to help guide you through that. So I'd love to take some time for everybody to maybe like a minute for you guys to read one of our champions' letters to the editor from last year's World Mosquito Day, or World Malaria Day publication push. And so I'll give everyone about a minute to read this. All right. Does anyone want to share? Does anyone want to share maybe something they're noticing that this letter to the editor does right, or any comments about this? No? Happy to walk you guys through it, but is there anything you see here that you feel like is being done right here? And yeah, feel free. Are they able to just talk, Amma, or no? Apologies if I might have missed that.
No, they should be able to raise their hand or drop a note in the chat if they'd like to participate. I saw Julia made a comment, so you're able to request that they unmute themselves, or you might have to if they can't.
Well, let me just go ahead, if you guys can drop it in the chat, and I can go ahead and read out what you guys are saying in the chat. Oh, hi guys, sorry, I'm just looking for the chat for the first time. Yes, she does a really good job at making her story personal too, as to why she's, why she's advocating for this issue and why this is so important to her, for sure. Let me just go through this. So I kind of broke this down for us. So, as we talked about kind of in the attention grabbing opening that showcases kind of her authority to talk about that issue, which is really important. Like, I think as people are reading an LTE, they're often wondering, why is this person why does this person have the authority to talk about this issue? And, you know, saying something like, I'm a survivor of malaria, or, you know, something that gives you sort of the power and authority to say, I can speak about this issue. And so another really important thing to note is that while you guys have a lot of experience hearing about malaria, learning about malaria, and knowing about the issue, many people, especially because malaria is not something that impacts a lot of you know, Americans in their everyday life, many people have no idea what this disease is. And so really important to make sure that you remember that not everyone's an expert and that you need to break things down, you know, as someone who might not know anything about this disease, maybe even never heard of it. So good to provide a brief explanation as to what it is. And, you know, for something like World Mosquito Day, it's probably pretty important to talk about the vector, to talk about how mosquitoes are the reason why people get malaria and die from malaria every year. And then she sort of moves from back and forth from like, this is a large issue to this is an issue that impacted me. And I think that's really important because oftentimes, you know, saying that a mosquito bite kills nearly 500,000 people every year, that's a super overwhelming statistic. It's very important for people to know, but it also is important to move from the larger context of things to this is, you know, more qualitative. This is my personal story with it to help people just really get a full picture of how this is impacting, because yeah, 500,000 people every year, that's super staggering and very overwhelming to a lot of people. And then again, sort of, this is another way you don't have to have had experienced malaria in order to feel like you can talk about this issue. So like she's showcasing her authority, and another way to talk about this issue is that she's been an advocate for with Nothing But Nets for malaria funding, tying it to a particular, you know, relevant issue happening. As you guys know, COVID is still extremely relevant, and you know, we'll provide some talking points that sort of help ground the, you know, those ties of COVID and malaria. But just tying it to a relevant, timely issue always makes it more relevant in the media cycle. And then the ask, you know, the most important thing that we're trying to advocate for, which is that we need, you know, we need to allocate money towards programs like the Global Fund, who are fighting, you know, the spread of COVID-19 and malaria. And then just sort of tying it off back to like, you know, back to what's important, and getting out, you know, a way for people, like I said, to get more involved, which is super important. So people just don't feel like they have the information and then they have nothing to do with it, with that information that they just got. So the pitching process, you know, writing, you're going to get a ton of resources from us for the writing portion of this, but the pitching process can seem really daunting for a lot of people. I promise you, it's really not. It's just a matter of making sure that you follow kind of this particular timeline. So making sure you do your research. No publication in your local newspaper or your local community is too small. So research the publications around you and in your area, and make sure that you research what they've been writing about and covering lately. And oftentimes they will have an instructions page for how to submit an LTE or an op-ed. So just make sure that you're doing your research on those publications, to make sure that you're sending it to the most relevant place. And then usually the way that you'll pitch a letter to the editor is that you'll either submit through an online form, which is the most common thing I see, is to submit through some sort of portal they have on their website. But sometimes you will have to send an email. So again, make sure you're checking those guidelines, because you don't want to write a 250 word LTE and, you know, it's wonderful, it's great, it looks beautiful, and you submit it, but their guidelines say that they only take 150 word LTEs. So just make sure beforehand. I would actually recommend that you research where you want to submit your LTE even before you write it, because then that allows you to see, okay, well then I need to write a 150 word one, or this is their particular submission guidelines, so that you don't create something that you inevitably then have to go adapt. And then just a small tip for submitting to via email is that you don't want to use attachments or any sort of images. This is just something to avoid being kind of caught up in the spam email track. And so oftentimes places won't accept pitches that have attachments, or it will go straight to spam. So if you are going to submit an LTE and they have you do it by email, just go ahead and paste your LTE straight into the body of that email. It really helps avoid making sure, or it really helps make sure that your actual email is seen, which is very important. And so follow up. You may submit an LTE and it should be you should hear from them relatively quickly on whether or not they are going to publish or not publish your LTE. But, journalists are busy people and they may not follow up readily. And there's kind of a faux pas in the media relations world where you don't want to submit your letters to the editor to 7 different places all at once, because you don't want it to get published in multiple places. It's kind of just frowned upon by journalists and by newspapers, and it sort of damages your relationship that you could have with that newspaper moving forward. So what you want to do is you kind of want to make sure that you have where you want to submit, you submit it. If they haven't gotten back to you in 2 or 3 days, you follow up with them. You say, hey, did you see this? I'd love to know if you're going to publish this, or if not, I am going to submit it to another publication in X amount of days or whatever. So just being really transparent about that. They'll usually, after the second follow-up, they'll follow up with you and let you know if they are interested or if they're not going to publish it. And then, of course, if your LTE does get placed and please let us know and please track that. And hopefully the journalists will let you know that your LTE has been published, but I've found that sometimes that they don't. You'll just see it one day. And so many champions have been surprised to find that their LTE is published in an outlet, which is a good surprise. But yeah, so if you know that your LTE is getting placed or has been placed and you see it, please send it over to us, and we will do vice versa. We will do the same. I'll reach out and make sure that you guys know if your LTE has been published if you don't. And if it doesn't get published and you still want to share it, you can always throw this on your blog or on your social media channels. And we're also happy, and I have in the past worked with champions to get their LTEs or op-eds published on our blog, so we can share that out there. So next steps are going to be, we will send you guys a toolkit, like I've mentioned, that are going to have all of the things, the template, some talking points, and more further instructions on, the timeline for this. So that'll come to you guys early next week, I believe on Tuesday. And then World Mosquito Day is August 20th. So ideally we would have the drafts the first week of August, so that we can provide any feedback, have some time to look them over, and then you guys will have a couple weeks of room to be able to submit those, which would be ideal for that. And it'd be also great when you send over your LTEs, if you could send over where you plan to submit to, just so we can go ahead and give those outlets a double check and see if they have any suggestions for submission. And then this presentation will be provided to you, but the Barbara Augustino's letter to the editor, the one that we read through as a case study, is linked in here, as well as an op-ed that Renee Perez had published a couple years back in the Sun Sentinel.